Hi and welcome. You're listening to the X22 Report. My name is Dave and this is episode 1409A and today's date is October 24th, 2017 and the title of the episode is The U.S. is in worse economic shape than China and Russia. What you're not being told. Let's get into the economic collapse financial news. Now, we've been watching many different companies and one of them is Caterpillar and their sales, their earnings have been down for many, many months, something like 22 months in a row. And then all of a sudden, everything started to turn around and they started to do a lot better. September's global retail sales rose by 13% year on year. And again, we need to understand what happened here. What they started to do was they started to close down all their factories. They started to trim, lay off individuals, and all of a sudden, they're saying that, equipment sales are up, everything's better. And what we're really seeing is basically huge layoffs. A lot of factories were closed down. They cut off some of their sales, which were where they weren't making sales. And they're trying to convince everyone that everything is fine. And when we look at this, we can see that over the last, couple of months or so, they're showing that, yes, everything is great again. But what's very interesting is if we go back to the year 2012, going into 2013, that's when everything completely fell apart. And from 2013 all the way to 2017, they've had negative sales. They've had, sales that were declining. They had earnings that were dropping, revenue that was dropping, and they made a huge amount of cuts. They closed a lot of factories. They had stock buybacks. They laid off a lot of individuals. And now they're telling us that the company's doing well. And this is not the first company that we've seen this. We've seen it many, many times before. Now, very interestingly, UBS is out there and they're saying, listen, this information that's coming out of all these different countries out of the United States, all this survey information, well, this stuff isn't real. This is fake economics. And what we're seeing right now is that the services and manufacturing in America, they came out with their new survey, Manufacturing PMI, and this is showing that everything is fine and everything's great. And the UBS chief economist, Paul Donovan, explains that this is fake economics. The trend of correlation between these numbers and reality is declining. Investors should ask themselves, when did I last voluntarily fill in a survey before placing faith in survey evidence? And he's absolutely right. All this survey data is absolutely meaningless. We see right now that the so-called FANG group of stocks, which is Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google, fell for the fifth day yesterday. This is the longest losing streak since right after the election. Now remember, the FANGs have been pumped up by the central banks, by easy money, and they're trying to make it look like everything is fine by saying that the FANG tech stocks have been doing great. And we've seen this in the past before where they take a group of stocks, they use this to show that everything is great while all the other companies and the smaller companies are doing horribly. They show us that everything is great. But what we're seeing right now is they are starting to drop and it doesn't look that great. Now, analysts, they're cutting expectations for the big tech firms ahead of earnings. The problem is analysts are saying that, well, how could this be happening? Because it looks like their sales, their revenue, well, it's dropping. And how can their stocks be at an average 74 times earnings? The multiple is 3 times that of the S&P 500. And it's not just the tech stocks, it's the biotechs. They're stumbling hard too, down 6% from recent highs. And it looks like things are getting worse. Now, Kotlikoff, who's an economist, is saying, something isn't right here. And he's saying that America is in worse financial shape than Russia or China. Now, America's 2017 fiscal gap will come in near $6 trillion, 9 times higher than the $666 billion deficit announced by the U.S. Department of Treasury last week. And Lawrence Kotlikoff is saying that something is broke. The country is broke. So what is he really looking at? Well, he's looking at the accounting methods that the U.S. government uses. And by his estimates, the total U.S. government debts are more than $200 trillion when unfunded liabilities are included. Now, he's explaining this to Congress because he's testifying in front of Congress right now. And he's saying that government officials, they are well aware that many of America's debts and accruing liabilities, well, they're being written off the books. And many of those individuals who know about this, they're keeping their mouths shut. He's saying we are working with a two-tiered reporting system. And the two-tier financial reporting system is as follows, where politicians, insiders have access to key data buried in footnotes about unfunded liabilities, which indicate that there are huge problems in the economy. The public, on the other hand, well, they're listening to the corporate media, they're listening to the White House, they're listening to the Fed, and they believe that everything is fine. And they're saying that the economy is doing well. And he's saying that this needs to be changed because we're working with two different systems, and those who are really looking at the entire budget, looking at the economy of the United States, they realize that the economy is not doing well, but they're not saying anything. And there are more than 1,200 of the country's top economists. They have endorsed this new plan that he's trying to put out there. They're all trying to put this out there, saying that the Congressional Budget Office needs to do fiscal gap and generational accounting on an ongoing basis. Now, this methodology was tried once before by George Bush Sr., and he included the fiscal gap accounting in some of his budgeting. Now, it wasn't widespread. They started to do this, but when Clinton came into office, the Clinton administration killed the practice, and it was never followed up. So, decades later, few people realized that the only reason that the Clintons were able to balance their budgets was not by recording all the U.S. government debts. Now, George W. Bush also did the same thing. They didn't account for the wars, and this has been going on for quite a while, where they leave certain things out. Can you imagine if you were able to do this in your own household, saying, hey, you know something? I'm just not going to count my car payment. I'm not going to count my credit card payment. I'm just going to leave that off and pretend they just don't exist. This is what the government does. And this is why when they come out with these numbers, it's very fancy, manipulated accounting to make everyone think that everything is fine. But what he's uncovered is that they understand and they already know that the whole entire system is in a huge bunch of trouble. And this is why they cannot stop borrowing from the Fed. They can't balance anything. They're not going to be able to bring manufacturing back. They're not going to be able to save the economy. It's completely impossible at this point unless we start to cut a lot of these programs, and people will become very angry. So we have two things that we can do at this point. One, we can say, all right, listen, and this is the same that goes in anyone's household. We're not making enough money. We're going to have to cut out one car. We're going to have to move out of the house. We're going to have to go rent something, which is half of what we used to pay. We're going to have to get rid of the credit cards. We can't pay for a gym membership, Netflix, Hulu, and everything else. All that's gone. We're going to have to do haircuts ourselves, and we have to change our lifestyles completely. Now, of course, a lot of people can't do this. You find it very difficult to do this. Well, the government needs to do this. But again, the American people will become very angry. And those people in government will sit there and take the blame for it. Or they can let the whole system crash, which I think this is what they're heading for. Because once again, if the system comes down and they do all of this, well, the Fed is going to be blamed. The government officials are going to be blamed. And they don't want this to happen. If there's a collapse with someone else to blame, and of course they're not just going to have a collapse and say, hey, it was our fault. The collapse is going to be triggered by somebody else. What do I mean by this? It's going to be triggered by another country, another group, either through a cyber attack in a physical event, or anything there above. And they will blame this on that other group. And this way they can say, hey, we were in a recovery, everything was fine until this certain group did this. And we can see right now that this is what they're building up to. Now, since all these government officials, I mean, if an outside economist can look at the numbers and say, hey, this is what's going on, you know right off the bat, they know exactly what's going on. And nobody's saying anything. Nobody said anything about these subprime securities. Everyone kept their mouth shut. Even those individuals who were out there screaming and yelling and went to the rating agencies, still nothing was said. Everyone just stayed quiet until the very end. The same thing's going to happen again. But this time it's going to be on a wider scale. It's going to affect everyone. But the finger pointing is going to be someplace else. This is why you need to be ready and prepared for what is coming. Because they're not telling you everything. They never do. And once the truth does come out, it's always too late. And it's not the full truth. That's the problem. They tell you bits and pieces to make themselves feel better, but the overall truth of why this all happened, going back in time, they're not going to tell you this. They're going to blame it on someone else. And when the system starts to come down and bills can't be paid through the government, programs can't be paid, people can't get their health insurance, people can't get their food stamps, well, we're going to see a huge amount of problems. We're going to see people very angry, people in the streets. When the inflation hits and people can't get their merchandise in the stores and the prices are continually rising, which I really mean the value of the dollar is decreasing, people are going to become very, very angry. And this is why you need to have all these supplies ready, because that day is coming. We are at the end of the cycle. The beginning of the cycle was back in 71 when we came off the gold standard, when we went onto the petrodollar system. Yes, there was a period of time where there were a lot of people in the 70s that were unemployed. Inflation was high. They were printing a lot of money. They had to raise the interest rates very, very high to control the situation. And this is why you saw house prices move up very, very quickly. This is why salaries jumped, because they had to readjust everything. Here we are at the back end. Salaries are declining. They can't do anything with it. They can't raise the interest rates. They're at zero or negative. They can't change anything at this point because this is the end of the system. In the beginning of the system in 1971, we didn't have that much debt. Here, we have a huge amount of debt. We have so many programs. We're dependent on this money printing. We can't stop. And there's nothing they can do at this time. This is why you need to be ready and prepared. Listen, everyone, thanks a lot for listening. Be well, be safe, and especially be prepared. Thanks a lot.